Hello, and welcome to the Megan Taylor Creative Podcast, a show for entrepreneurs looking to grow their business with digital marketing. In this episode, I'll be exploring the basics of branding and how to tell your brand story with content marketing and design. Let's get started. So, in this episode of the Megan Taylor Creative Podcast, I wanted to talk about how to tell your brand story and the basics of branding because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially as I'm shifting focus to starting to look a bit more at my personal brand, which is something that I kind of put on the back burners a little bit as I've been focusing largely on Megan Taylor Creative, which is my digital marketing agency. And that's more of a corporate business. But I also realized that in owning an agency and in being an agency owner, I essentially have a personal brand as well that I need to keep up. And it's something that I've not really looked into too much. So that's going to be changing. And a lot of that starts for me personally, at least, with creating a personal website and also just being a bit more personable online. And I have really tried to do that on Twitter, especially because I find that the personable, shareable content over there does really well in terms of engagement. So that's kind of been my main focus. But yeah, as I said, we're going to be talking about the basics of branding and how to actually tell your brand story with content marketing and design, and those two key aspects and how they will actually propel your brand into your market and how it's going to help you stand out. So yeah, as always, this is probably going to be quite a long episode. So let's just get straight into it. The first step to being able to tell your brand story with content and design is to have a clear vision. And this was one of the things that I really worked on when I first started Megan Taylor Creative, is how I wanted the brand to look, not only in terms of the actual visual elements, but also how people would perceive the brand when they're reading content and when they're seeing what I'm posting online. Initially, I think that I thought the brand needed to be a little bit more corporate, maybe because it's a digital marketing agency. But then the more I started learning about some content marketing and digital marketing trends and the sort of content that was really connecting with people, I realized that personable content is really where it's at, especially with the influx and voracious appetite that modern day audiences have for vertical and short form content, which tends to be more candid and more true to life as opposed to long form, well thought out YouTube videos. I think long form content does really well and it has its place, but I think that in terms of branding, if you're wanting to really tell your story, I would focus on short form content and things like social media to start telling your brand story. But again, how do you actually get there? Well, starting to build a brand's vision is quite difficult because we see so many other people do so many cool things with branding. And as a solopreneur or someone who's just starting out in business for the first time, it might feel a little bit intimidating to actually start thinking about what you want your brand to look like, because you might have so many ideas but not know how to put them into play and not know how to put them into action. So that's where having a vision helps you start to start your brand and start your brand story. And I think the initial brainstorming phase where you're trying to figure out those key brand elements are crucial. But I would also recommend not being super tied to the early branding as well. You see a lot of big brands do rebrands, and that's because they're learning about their business and their target audience and what works and what doesn't. And sometimes a brand may feel outdated, and that's fine. I imagine that in a year's time or 2 years' time, I probably want to do a brand refresh for Megan Taylor Creative as well. I think it's serving me well now, but I know that in the future it may actually not be true to the initial vision that I had. And I'm lucky that I recently updated my website. So I've got the most up-to-date version of what my brand looks like and the vision that I see for it. But I know over time that I'll need to keep refreshing that so that it is true to form. So that's important to remember. But I would, if you're not sure about the sort of brand that you want and you're a bit lost about the vision that you have, I would look at competitors, because if you look at other people that are outside of your niche, it can start to get really overwhelming and you won't be able to pinpoint exactly what key branding elements you'll need to incorporate for your brand within your industry. So that really helps just kind of streamline the research process so you don't get too overwhelmed. And things I would look for include the classic things we think of when it comes to branding. So things like logos and typography and just general UX design, especially on a website. That's really helped me kind of define my website recently. I've looked at a lot of my competitors to see that actually simple is better, but that might not be the case with, say, like a tech SaaS brand. You might need a bit more of a complex design to get your branding across and to appeal to your target audience. I'd also have a look at how they talk online and their online presence as well, what type of content they're making on social media, whether they have a blog or they're doing video content, and the specific topics that they're covering. And in that, I would look at things like their messaging, how they're telling their brand story, whether they have any lead magnets that you can borrow from, kind of try and test out, but obviously do your own version of it. So that's how I would start defining your vision. And then the next couple of steps should actually help you to bring that vision to life. So now that you have started to identify your brand's vision and what you actually want it to look like, let's take a look at the next step, which will have a real impact on your choices regarding your branding moving forward, and that is identifying your target audience. And I think that branding is one of those things where you want to create a brand that you're really happy with, that really represents you, but you also need to make sure that it appeals to your target audience as well. And by knowing your target audience from the beginning, you can do that very easily. You don't run into the risk of creating and working so hard to develop a brand that you might really like, but actually it's not going to appeal to your target audience in any way, and that's going to have an impact on your brand's growth in the early days. And it's hard because you spent so much time on that, but at the same time, if it's not serving your business, then it's not doing its job. So actually knowing your target audience from the very beginning should really help with this, because it should help you identify which colors to use, what type of language you should use, the type of messaging that you should be using, and which social platforms you should be on, and whether long form or short form content will be more compelling to your target audience, and what sort of lead magnets will be important to your target audience and how to design those. Because a huge part of, say, for example, lead magnets is ultimately the design. If you can't catch the attention of your audience with a great design, then you're going to struggle. And I think that design is actually something that is overlooked, especially when it comes to us content marketers. I get quite annoyed when I see people say that you just need to write something and the design isn't important. And in some instances, I would say yes. So for example, with email marketing, I found that just sending the classic kind of plain text emails tends to actually do better than, say, the emails that have all the graphics and the bells and whistles on them. But with things like blogs and your website specifically, design is so important, but it's got to be a design that your audience can digest. For some audiences, say for example, if you're appealing to people in the tech industry who have a lot of knowledge about technology and probably have a lot of knowledge about web design to begin with, they might expect something slightly more well-rounded and refined than, say, for example, if it's a copywriter. Most copywriters' websites are really simple, and with good reason, because we want our target audience to see what our skills are. We don't necessarily need the design to carry the website. But that said, it does give you a bit of an edge having a great website with great copy and great design, because your design can essentially tell your target audience from a branding perspective exactly who you are, what to expect from your brand, what sort of service they might get from you or product they might get from you, and it will kind of help them essentially give signifiers to them about whether or not they actually want to communicate with your brand. So, the last thing that you need to do in order to tell your brand story through content and design is to actually identify your brand story to begin with. And every brand will have a different story, because every brand was created by someone entirely different, and someone who thinks differently and has different thoughts and ultimately a different life experience. And you want to make sure that this shines through in the brand story as a whole. And I think that by knowing your brand story, you can start to kind of carve it out through your web design as well as your content design. So when you're building your blog and building your resources, you know that what you're designing is actually tied to how you want your brand story to be portrayed. And I think that knowing how you're going to tell that from the very beginning is really important to actually having that early phase growth, because stories are ultimately what help people connect with brands. And if you don't have an intriguing and compelling story, then they might not really want to connect with you, and they might not really see your brand as something that's exciting. It's not going to stand out. It's going to be in the pile of all these other businesses that you no doubt have to compete with. So knowing exactly how to tell that story and then actually telling that story through content and design is really going to be important. And the things that you really need to know if you're going to do that are specifically your brand's mission statement, your brand values, and your unique selling point. Those three things are going to be key to ensuring that you're telling your brand story consistently in a way that's compelling to your target audience over time. And for me, I came up with my unique selling point very early on. I was lucky in that I had that experience, that background experience in marketing, and I knew just how key it was for me to have a differentiating factor as to why brands might want to work with me as opposed to my competitors very early on. And it did really help with early stage business growth. People were intrigued by the idea of creative content marketing, and that's essentially my differentiating factor. I know full well that there's thousands and thousands of other full service content marketing agencies that probably deliver similar services to what I do, but because of my approach and because of the way that I work, that's really what hooks people in. It's not necessarily the services, because they can get that from anywhere. It's the type of delivery that they'll get. And I think that's really important to understand. I think so many people think that, oh, well, I'm just a service provider, so I don't have a unique selling point because there's so many other people doing what I'm doing. But actually, you're the unique selling point. Think about what it is that, what's your experience? What's your industry experience? What are your values? Is there something about you that really sets you apart? Have you done something really big that will set you as like an industry leader? So have you spoken a lot at conferences, or have you won any awards or anything like that? It's not necessarily the accolades. It's just something to help you differentiate yourself from your competitors and start putting your brand as a thought leader and yourself as a thought leader and your brand as an authority within your industry. And knowing how to tell and craft your brand story is going to help that. And then when you start to actually create content, you can start thinking about, okay, which content do I need to make that's going to help me tell my story in a way that's going to help me attract more customers. So for example, although I'm a full service agency, most of my content is actually focused on content strategy rather than specific channels or specific tactics. It's a bit different on the podcast, but generally speaking, no matter what I'm talking about, I will be coming at it from a content strategy perspective, because that's that I focus on. And I would say that most clients and leads have come to me specifically with that in mind. They want that help. They want someone who can look at their content strategy from a fresh perspective, using the creator content marketing methodology to ensure that whatever I deliver to them will actually help them stand out. And this is essentially what I'm trying to say in this particular episode. I'm always thinking of how can I make the brand that I'm working with, how can I tell their story in a way that's going to really set them apart. And even if the brand that I'm working with has a unique selling point and has a messaging set in stone, I like to challenge that messaging because it gets them to think, and it gets them to think outside the box and look at whether their messaging is actually going to benefit them in any way. So yeah, that's everything that I have to cover in this episode. I really hope that this episode helps specifically those looking for a brand refresh and want to start creating a brand that's really going to make an impact, or young business owners who are just getting started and have no idea how to actually start to carve out their brand. I hope this gives you a bit of a roadmap, guideline as to how to get through those early days when you have so many ideas and you're not quite sure how to actually put them into practice and put pen to paper. So I really hope that that helped you. If you do need help with content strategy and positioning your brand and content design, we can help you get ahead of that. Will be specifically useful to those who are kind of further along in their brand journey and need us to kind of step in and take a look at what they've already written, what they've already come up with, and what they've already started doing. And we'll be able to kind of help you just think outside the box a little bit. So yeah, if you did want to work with us, I'll leave all the information down below. As always, if you like this episode, please like the video on YouTube and subscribe to our channel so that you can be made aware every time that a new podcast episode drops. And as always, I will speak to you next week. Bye.